Hey everybody, this is the fourth here, and in this video I wanted to give you just a few tips to help you out with the leveling process a little bit more. Now these tips are directly related to the previous video, which was all about the leveling process. So if you haven't watched that yet, I definitely recommend you go and watch that now. The playlist link will be in the description of this video. So the first tip I have for you is to not get too distracted by peak meters or other level meters, or attempt to base your level settings on them. From the previous video, you may have noticed that I didn't even mention the peaking levels of any of the sounds as I was mixing them in. The only times I mentioned peaking levels were when I was talking about headroom, and I never really mentioned them for setting the levels of your independent sounds. And this is because I really just pay little to no attention to my peak meters while setting the levels of my sounds. I really just listen and pay attention to how loud things sound and set my levels based on what I hear. You mainly want to use the level meter on the master track to ensure that you aren't clipping or exceeding 0 decibels. And this shouldn't be the case if you are mixing at an appropriate level and allowing yourself enough headroom. So while leveling, just really use your ears and maybe a spectrum monitor and a reference track to help you set your levels, rather than paying attention to what your levels are on the peak meters. If you haven't already, I would recommend you go watch the peak versus RMS versus loudness video, which is a part of this tutorial, to find out a bit more about why I recommend this and why this is the case. My next tip here is to allow yourself plenty of headroom. Usually when we talk about headroom in regards to mixing digital audio, we are essentially talking about the difference between the level your song peaks at and 0 decibels on the master track. It's generally suggested to leave 3 decibels of headroom or more while mixing. And you can see that if I play this track, it will be peaking at about -3 and below. The reason for this is mainly to help you avoid clipping the master while mixing. And if you don't leave yourself enough headroom, you might end up exceeding 0 decibels or pushing against a limiter if you have a limiter on the master track. The specific amount of headroom doesn't matter so much as long as you aren't clipping the master or pushing against that limiter. The third tip I have for you here is to not mix at too high of levels. And when I say this, I'm not talking about the levels inside your digital audio workstation, but rather the levels coming out of your headphones or monitors. You really only want to mix with your headphones or monitors loud enough so that you can hear things clearly. Louder usually sounds better, and if you're mixing at a level that is louder than necessary, you may perceive that your mix sounds better than it actually does. Or you may think that your kick hits harder or your snares punchier or anything like that than it actually is. If your mix sounds good at lower levels that you can still clearly hear it at, it will probably sound even better at higher levels. I personally find it a lot easier to set the levels of independent sounds within my mix more accurately when I'm listening to the mix at lower levels instead of louder levels. So my next tip here is if you find yourself needing guidelines to help you mix well, like maybe you don't trust your ears or you aren't quite familiar with your monitors or headphones yet, the best thing to do is to use a reference track. This way you have an accurate and relevant guide to help you get the levels of your various sounds right. Any tutorials that provide specific peaking levels or RMS levels for your sounds are pretty irrelevant for the same reason I mentioned in one of the previous tips, which again you can go check out that video, peak versus RMS versus loudness, and there really is no formula for a good mix. The fifth tip I have for you is don't make everything too loud. I think this is a problem that a lot of beginners kind of have. They want to make all of their sounds really loud because they want a loud mix. Or maybe they just don't quite realize how well you can actually perceive sounds that aren't really all that loud. Subtlety is important in your mix. Not every sound needs to be in your face, even in genres that are very in your face, like aggressive dubstep or hardstyle. It's important to consider the full mix while setting the levels of your sounds to ensure that any sounds that should be in the background are in the background. And even though I did mention that mastering won't really save your mix and you shouldn't rely on mastering in a previous video, it is something worth considering at least somewhat while mixing. And the tools you have available to you for the mastering process are really much better suited for correcting problems of sounds not being loud enough rather than them being too loud. And by this I mean, if you set your synth sounds a little bit too quiet compared to your drums, during the mastering process, you can use a bit of compression on that master track to bring those drum levels down and make them sit better with the rest of your synth sounds. But if you make your synth sounds too loud compared to your drums, you're not really going to be able to fix that during mastering at all. So my next tip here is about what you should do if you're kind of unsure how loud to make a certain sound in the mix. And my first recommendation, of course, would be to try and find a reference track that will help you get a good idea of what level your sound should be at. But if this doesn't really work, or you can't really find a good reference track for that sound, then what I would recommend you do is one of two things. The first thing would be to err on the side of making that sound too quiet, especially if it's something more of a background sound, like a pad or a crash cymbal or some kind of transition effect, because it would be much better for those kind of sounds to be too quiet rather than too loud. And that's kind of along the same lines as the previous tip I just gave you. But another technique that I read about once that I thought was pretty cool is to kind of take the range of levels that you think would be good for that sound and use a level in the middle of that range. So if you listen to this track, you'll hear a kick and a snare, and maybe I'm just not quite sure what level to put this snare at. So what I'm going to do is start by taking the level up until it sounds about good. And then I'll notice that it's peaking at about minus 12 decibels. So I'll write that down. And this is kind of the quietest that I think it would sound okay at. So I'll write that down, and then I'll take the level all the way up and do the opposite. Okay, so that sounds about good as far as the loudest I would want it. And you can see it's peaking at about minus 4 decibels. So from there, what I would do is average that out, and minus 4 and minus 12, I'll get minus 8. So I'll set that peaking level to be at minus 8 decibels. So that sounds pretty good. And that's just a technique I read about once quite a while ago, and I thought it was a pretty cool technique. So the next tip I have for you is to change how you listen to your mix. As you mix, it can be helpful to change how you are listening to your mix. There are 3 things I will regularly do while mixing that change how I hear my mix. You may find these useful as well, or you may not. The first of these is I will adjust the monitoring level. I adjust my master fader occasionally while mixing to get an idea of how the mix sounds at louder and softer levels. And instead of using the master level fader, you might use the volume control on your audio interface or anything like that, just as long as you're changing the level that's coming out of your speakers or headphones so that you can hear it both at lower volumes and at higher volumes to just get an idea of how it sounds at a variety of loudness levels. The next thing I will do is isolate certain frequency bands. When I want to get a better idea of how a certain frequency range sounds in my mix, I will use an EQ on the master to isolate that frequency range. And I do this just using Fruity Parametric EQ2, and I like to use a really sharp cutoff. So for example, isolating the high end can help you get a better idea of how well your kick cuts through the mix in the high end. And isolating the low end can help you detect muddiness and give you a better idea of how well your kick and bass get along. I've also found that isolating the low end will help you get a better idea of how well the punch of your snare, if you're using a snare with a low end punch, relates to your kick in terms of loudness. And these are the two that I use most often, are high passing and low passing. But you could also play around with band pass if you're having trouble with a certain frequency range and you want to try and clean that out. And then the last way that I will mix up how I'm listening to my mix is to solo or mute various sounds. You do want to be careful if you decide to do this, because the mix as a whole is more important than how individual sounds sound. But it can be helpful to solo a set of sounds if you want to hear how these specific sounds go together more clearly. So if you have a bunch of leads that are going to be playing at the same time, you could solo all of those leads and mute the drums. Or if you want to hear better how your kick gets along with your bass, you could solo that kick and your bass and, just do that kind of thing. So my next tip here is to check your mixes on other speakers. And this will be once you've finished your mix and you think it sounds good on your monitors. What I would recommend is listen to that mix on a variety of different speakers to see how it sounds on each of those different speakers. Listen to it on iPod headphones, listen to it on laptop speakers, computer speakers, your car speakers or home stereo, and just really as many different places as possible, especially as a beginner. Because this will really help you get familiar with your speakers or headphones that you're mixing with, and it'll help you better understand how the sound that's coming through your monitors or your headphones will relate to other sound systems. And maybe something will stand out on a certain set of speakers that you didn't quite pick up on while you were mixing. And especially if you notice something happening on multiple sets of speakers, then it will definitely be something that you might consider changing later on. So if you listen to your mix on a bunch of different speakers and the hi-hats just sound too loud on all of them, you probably would want to turn those down. The last tip I have for you here is to make sure you practice the step alone. And I've said this a couple times already, but I really just need to emphasize how important this step is and how much you need to practice. Because it really is the case that so many times I've read feedback threads or gotten asked for feedback, and people are asking about their compression or EQ or whatever when, their basic levels of the different sounds are kind of all over the place. EQ and compression are definitely important for a great mix, but you'd be surprised at how good of a mix you can achieve with leveling alone, especially if you're using good quality sounds. And EQ and compression are honestly a little bit useless if you don't understand this really fundamental part of mixing. But once you have leveling down well, and you think that your mixes are sounding decent, you can start learning and practicing other areas of mixing. And I have ordered this tutorial in a way that I think makes the most sense to learn and practice mixing.